2 years ago this month, President Biden ordered a total withdrawal from Afghanistan, where United States troops had been stationed for 20 years. In a span of just a few hours, President Biden reversed decades of service, including over 2,000 American lives lost, and left over $7 billion in resources given to the Afghan people as almost instantaneously the Taliban, the very enemy that we had entered Afghanistan to eliminate, retook the country. This evil, anti-American, brutally misogynistic regime is back in the Middle East, supporting terrorism abroad and against its own people. Many of us remember the videos of thousands of Afghan civilians sprinting, throwing themselves and their children on departing planes, desperately trying to flee Afghanistan for safe harbor in the United States. But since those days in 2021, our government and our media have ignored what actually happened. How and why did the withdrawal go so wrong? And what is the Taliban doing now? Today, I am honored to welcome an Afghanistan veteran and the author of a new book about this event to discuss these questions. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that you're having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified every time I post a Julie Noted news video or a Timeless episode. And also be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. Now, those of you who've been watching the show know that I talk a lot about foreign policy developments, especially ones of the last few years. We focus a lot on China and Russia. Obviously, China has become one of our most principal adversaries. They have established a spy base on Cuba. They sent that spy balloon traversing over the United States. That has captured a lot of our national attention. Certainly, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, just about a year into President Biden's time in office, has also been the subject of a lot of our attention. But what has not been the subject of our attention is the botched Afghanistan withdrawal that also took place in the early months of President Biden's presidency. I have been interested in this topic, though I haven't learned a lot about it until I read the book of the guest that we have on today. I am so honored to welcome James Hassan to the program. He is a former captain in the United States Army. He served in Afghanistan, where he received the Bronze Star Medal, and he is the author of this hugely important brand new book called Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. Hello, James. Thank you so much for coming on to the program, and above all else, thank you for your service.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor.
So I told you that I read your book last night and this morning, almost in its entirety. I just flew through it. It's a testament to how well you and your co-author, who I should mention, Jerry Dunleavy, write, that it was so riveting. And boy, I knew that the Afghan withdrawal was bad. I didn't know just how bad it was. And just quickly, for the viewers, I'd like to read a sentence from the prologue of your book. There are a lot of people who say that we should have gotten troops out after 20 years, and a lot of people who said that we shouldn't have. And you have this sentence, which I really appreciated, and you said, plenty of Americans and plenty of Afghanistan veterans hold differing views on this topic in good faith. No matter which side you choose in that debate, one thing is painfully clear: things did not have to turn out the way that they did.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And to be honest, Jerry and I thought that we knew the sheer scope of the disaster and everything that went on there when we started writing the book. And one thing that we learned is that we didn't even know the half of it. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the Biden administration's just completely toxic combination of ignorance and arrogance. And you mentioned China and Russia, and I appreciate that, because one thing that we try to do at the very end of the book was show how these mistakes are just going to continue to haunt us, especially with regards to China and especially with regards to Russia going forward. The Chinese Communist Party actually refers to this fiasco as the, quote, Kabul moment, which tells you kind of everything you need to know.
Yes, and I also don't think that it is a coincidence that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, just about 6 months after this botched withdrawal in Afghanistan happened. I think he saw the way that the United States now under President Biden handles foreign policy, and the Russians were probably quite pleased and were empowered to do what they did.
Yeah, I think you're 100% correct. And as we lay out in Kabul, we interviewed a former station chief, CIA station chief, who from the Moscow office of the CIA, the Moscow station, and he told us unequivocally that you can draw a direct line from Kabul to Kyiv, and what we mean by that is between America's humiliation on the world stage and the clear message that we sent that we won't even lift a finger to protect our own citizens, much less anyone else. And President Putin's decision to then invade Ukraine. And it's funny you mentioned that it was 6 months later. Beginning in September, as we lay out in the book, Russia started a military buildup of forces in September 2021, close to the Ukraine border. And we lay all of that out in the book. But the connection is just unmistakable. And so that's one thing that we talk about. And one of the others is that, one of the other main points of the book, and probably the biggest point of the book, is to tell the story of all of the mistakes that were made, the consequences it had, not just for the Afghan citizens who were left behind, which those are immense, but also for the men and women who were placed in a no-win situation, being forced to rely on the Taliban for their own security, while the Taliban were executing our Afghan allies in full view. And so the administration would love to whitewash this. They would love for the American people to forget. And they're clearly not going to hold themselves accountable. So we wrote the book partly to make sure that somebody holds them accountable.
Yes. So before we get to the specifics, and there are many, of this botched withdrawal, let's set the scene a bit. I think most Americans know that the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks because the Taliban, which was in charge of Afghanistan, was providing a safe harbor to Al-Qaeda, the group which was behind the terrorist attacks on 9/11. I think most Americans know that. Most Americans know that we overthrew the Taliban, but what a lot of Americans don't know is, okay, well, once we overthrew the Taliban, why were we there for 20 years? Can you fill that in for us? And also, please tell us when you served in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So I was there in 2014 and 2015 in the eastern province, kind of on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. But it's actually a great question because when we first started exploring this project, one of the things that we had to grapple with was that, if you're going to tell the full story of Afghanistan, there are 20 years of mistakes. And it's simply impossible to do that in a way that doesn't, just put everyone asleep and it doesn't resemble war and peace. But the bottom line is that we chose this moment in time because this is where it all fell apart, and all those sacrifices that thousands, hundreds of thousands, really, of American troops made were just cast aside. But to just give a very quick overview of those intervening 20 years, we didn't kill Osama bin Laden, which was the stated goal of why we were there, was to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. That didn't happen until 2011. But Al-Qaeda was there and still is there today, and is now actually, playing a role in the Afghan or the Taliban government. And some of the senior Taliban leaders are card-carrying members of Al-Qaeda. But all of that aside, and we slowly drew down the number of troops that we had there, and the intensity of kind of our direct combat operations. But all of that aside, we could have been there for 3 years, we could have been there for 20, we could have been there for 30. And what happened in the summer of 2021, which we detail at length in Kabul, was not just a travesty, but just something that was completely unprecedented in American history. And when I say that, I'm referring in part to the fact that we abandoned thousands of Americans to the mercy of a Stone Age terrorist regime, which the US government has never done. And hopefully, if this book has the impact that we intend it to, it will never happen again.
It really is amazing. I had no idea. And you're right, this is unlike anything that has ever happened in our history. Let's go here back to the Trump presidency, because as you say in your book, and as the American people know very well, President Biden blames President Trump, or he likes to shift some of the responsibility on President Trump for this withdrawal. And he says, hey, the Trump administration was the one that decided that we were going to leave Afghanistan after 20 years. We just followed it through once we took over in 2021. You complicate, or your book, I should say, complicates that understanding a bit, where you outline that it is true that President Trump and his administration wanted to leave, but it was under certain conditions that the Taliban had to fulfill in order for the American troops to be withdrawn. What were those conditions, and what was the different direction President Biden took this withdrawal from his predecessor?
Yeah, it's a great question, because that has been the go-to narrative for the Biden administration. Basically, once this all collapsed, it's interesting. They didn't use that narrative when they thought somehow that this was all going to be a stunning success. But
right.
Once everything went poorly,
yes,
they immediately pointed the finger back to the Trump administration and said, well, our hands were tied. And as we lay out in Kabul, that's just simply not true. It's interesting. One of I'll get to the Doha agreement and the conditions based nature of that in a second. But just to underscore how disingenuous that talking point is, one thing that we reveal in the book is that during Biden's first week in office, he asked his advisors, how quickly can we get out of Afghanistan? He didn't say, how can we do it safely? He didn't say, how can we do it without undermining the Afghan military that's already shaky? He didn't say, how can we do it while making sure we keep our promises to American citizens or Afghans? It was simply, how quickly can we get out of Afghanistan? Mm-hmm. And specific to the Doha agreement itself, which was negotiated under the Trump administration, we're critical of that. We think it was a flawed agreement, and I think history clearly bears that out. But it did have several conditions that the Taliban needed to meet before any withdrawal happened. And so the two principal conditions were, one, they had to stop hosting Al-Qaeda, stop providing any safe harbor, and to ensure that Al-Qaeda did not have any kind of presence within the country. And they clearly failed to meet that. We were killing members of Al-Qaeda before the agreement. We were killing members of Al-Qaeda immediately after the agreement. And the second one was that they had to, for the duration of kind of that agreement period until the withdrawal happened, if it did, they had to stop completely all attacks on American forces. And it's interesting, and the second part is especially interesting because, uh, Secretary Austin told Congress that the Taliban was largely keeping this commitment. And uh, as we lay out in Kabul over and over again, that just simply wasn't the case. They were still attacking Americans as we withdrew. Uh, so the idea that their hands were tied somehow, it just doesn't hold water. And it's a convenient excuse now, but it's certainly not something that they wanted to, quote unquote, give the Trump administration credit for when they thought this was something, to be credited. And regardless, it just wasn't the case.
You just mentioned something that was shocking to read in the book, which is that there were some members of our government, both under President Trump and under President Biden, who, despite all of the evidence that the Taliban was continuing to provide safe harbor and indeed work alongside Al Qaeda, these members of the government would continue to say, oh no, they have fulfilled the conditions of the Doha Agreement. They're not working with Al Qaeda anymore and we can withdraw. One of these characters, if that's what we can call them, is the State Department Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation, Zalmay Khalilzad. You refer to him in the book as Zal, which, by the way, thank you, because that's what I'm going to do now, so I don't butcher his name. You outline how he was kind of weirdly cozying up to the Taliban, both under President Trump, and you say President Trump chose him to be a part of this Afghanistan potential withdrawal. And that's on President Trump. It's also on President Biden for inheriting him, keeping him along in the subsequent administration. But this guy, Zal, he's cozying up to the Taliban. And the Pentagon is giving all of this evidence that the Taliban is continuing to work with Al Qaeda. And Zal is continuing to say, no, they're not. And we can do this withdrawal. Was this person acting in bad faith? Was this person stupid? What was going on here?
It's interesting because we don't speculate about his motives. But what is very, very clear is that he was kind of the head honcho in charge of leading these negotiations, and everything, and he was dead set on an agreement that pulled U.S. forces out, and he was equally dead set on ensuring that there was a narrative that the Taliban and Al Qaeda were somehow separate, that the Taliban would be reliable actors, all the way through. And one thing that we mentioned in the book, and we get this firsthand from members of the Intelligence Committee, was that they considered actually cutting him off from certain intelligence briefings because they were concerned that those would make their way to the Taliban. And in fact, he actually asked if it would be acceptable to give the Taliban a heads up on operations that we might be conducting against groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. And his reason for that was, well, they're not the same group, which, as we mentioned, Al Qaeda and the Taliban continue to overlap. As we discuss elsewhere, there's plenty of friendly cooperation at times between ISIS and the Taliban, especially in Kabul. But regardless, that was a non-starter with the CIA and with members of the Intelligence Committee. And when he asked why, they simply said, because that's how you get dead Americans. But it was just, it perfectly encapsulates his failure and his toxic role in this entire fiction of peace with the Taliban from start to finish.
It's unbelievable. I mean, I mean this as a rhetorical question. I'm sure you're wondering it as much as I. How does someone like this end up in our government? And not just in our government, in the highest echelons, making these decisions?
I wish I could tell you.
Yes.
But what I can tell you is that he wasn't the only person that was making terrible decisions, and also acting just based on a worldview and hoping that reality conformed with it, I think is probably the easiest way to describe that. For example, in the months leading up to the collapse of the Afghan government, the military was repeatedly urging the State Department and particularly the officials at the embassy in Kabul, which at the time was the largest US embassy in the world, to begin planning for an eventual closure of the embassy and evacuation. And they got a lot of pushback from the embassy on that. And the acting ambassador at the time explicitly stated, how can we influence democracy in Afghanistan if we don't have an embassy when the Taliban takes over? Which just, in a nutshell, encapsulates the entire kind of magical thinking that they had, that somehow everything was going to work out okay. Yes. And as history shows, it didn't.
Yes.
And people need to be held accountable.
So we're now going to move on to what happened when President Biden took the baton, if you will, and decided to go forth with these with this withdrawal. But I'd like to pause for a moment and make a point clear that is really, really important. There is this idea that over the past decade or so, with the American presence in Afghanistan, that it has come at a huge cost to American life. Now, at the beginning, when the United States invaded Afghanistan, as I mentioned in the introduction, there were over 2,000 American lives lost, and that is obviously not to be forgotten. However, it is crucial to note that if we look at 2015 to 2020, the number of American military deaths in Afghanistan was actually quite low. Every life is precious. Every American life, service life is precious. We know that. But I just want to read these numbers for the audience. This is from 2015 to 2020. 22, 9, 14, 14, 21, and 11. That's how many American service people were killed in each of those years, respectively. So our presence in Afghanistan was certainly coming at a huge financial cost, but in these last few years, it was not coming at an enormous cost to American life. So I just wanted to make that clear, because that was one of the talking points of the Biden administration. I would like to give you the opportunity to react.
Yeah, well, one thing I want to say at the outset is just that one life is too many.
Of course.
Yeah, and I knew, I had a friend who was killed in action there in 2018. So, one life is absolutely too many. And but the broader point that this was a different nature of warfare, and that I think the broader point is we could have conducted things through ISR assets, through which remotely operated unmanned vehicles, drones is what everyone kind of ubiquitously refers to them as. Those weren't available in 2001. We're also operating in plenty of other places across the Middle East. And I think the idea that, and candidly, I was not a huge fan of maybe staying in Afghanistan indefinitely. But at the same time, the way that this happened was just the absolute perfect storm. And there was a way to do this in a very controlled and safe, relatively safe way. But that would have been to hold on to Bagram. Forgive me if I've mentioned this before, but when the president decided to abandon Bagram, that relegated the entire evacuation, which was inevitable, to a single strip airfield in the middle of a dense urban center, with high ground kind of on all sides. Just a completely defenseless and indefensible position. And at the same time, it freed the ISIS suicide bomber who was captured by the CIA and was in a prison adjacent to Bagram Airfield, Parwan Prison. Um, he was freed when the Taliban overran it, and 11 days later, made his way to Abbey Gate and um, and committed the attack that we all now have heard about and should never forget.
We're going to get to those details in a moment, but first I would like to tell you all about My Pillow. Certain events keep us all up at night, but we all also deserve a good night's rest. That's why Mike Lindell created My Pillow to help you get the best sleep that you need and deserve. That's also why he created the Giza Dream bed sheets, which are coming at a discount if you use the promo code Hartman, which is my last name, spelled Hartman. For a limited time, you will get 60% off of these Giza Dream sheets. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll get a set for as low as $39.99, and for a limited time, with any purchase, you will also receive Mike's soft cover book free with the promo code Hartman. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listener square and use the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. Okay. So let's pick up on some of these very important details. So President Biden has taken office. He's decided, as you said, within the first few weeks, he says, how fast can we get out of Afghanistan? It is August of 2021. What is happening? Let's go forth with these details.
Okay. So throughout all of July and leading up into August, the Taliban were just taking over district by district. It was easy to see what was happening. And one Green Beret colonel who was the chief of staff of the Special Operations Command Central during the whole process described it as watching kind of that advance on the map as the red blob just descending on Kabul. Color red because that's how the military codes and enemy forces on maps. And beginning on early days of August, it just was a domino effect, which was not only predictable but also predicted. And by August 14th, the Taliban were outside the gates, and President Ghani just abdicated completely without giving any warning, although his inner circle seemed to have a good amount of heads up that that's what he was going to do, because they fled just hours afterwards. And then the Taliban were rolling through the gates. And at that point, because the State Department had failed to even really begin preparations for an embassy evacuation until days prior, they were still trying to burn sensitive documents. Many of them were left behind, identifying the Afghan allies that we had working with them, which, for lack of a better term, just became a target list for the Taliban. And also, pulling out weapons and other sensitive equipment. And it was so haphazard that the soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division, who were helping evacuate all of those embassy staffers, had to go door to door across the whole sprawling complex to make sure that no one was left behind, because they had no idea, or the embassy had no idea who was still there and who had already been taken to the airfield. And around the same time, of course, once word spread that the Taliban were at the, barbarians are at the gates, they descended on the airfield, and are only 600 American soldiers left in the country, soldiers and Marines. And the U.S. was relying on Afghan military units to guard portions of the Kabul airfield. And of course they left, and that's when the gates got flooded or overrun. And you saw those now famous images of thousands of Afghans just flooding the airfield and clinging onto planes and trying to do whatever they possibly could to get to safety or
flee what they are facing.
American
Yes.
American protection.
And we in the United States took several hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilians who are now here living in the United States, thankfully. But so many were left behind. So many, and you outlined this, tortured, killed. The Taliban just closed beauty salons in Afghanistan because they don't want women to go out and work or to have any kind of celebration or enjoyment of beauty. We don't understand how brutal this regime is. And boy, all that work, 20 years of work, just down the tubes because of this overly rushed, I mean, that what you just said, that anecdote of people in the embassy going, seeing if people are left behind, it shows you just how rushed this was. How could it have gone differently? That's kind of the $64 million question. If you were designing the withdrawal, what would you have done?
I think how the military laid it out and recommended that it be done was the way that it should have been done, and that is they should have held Bagram. And because of that, because Bagram is built for the type of evacuation that we ended up having to do. And it's funny, the Obama administration, believe it or not, conducted a feasibility analysis of what a withdrawal would look like and whether it could be done without Bagram, and based solely on just the Kabul airfield. And they concluded that it would be impossible. Joe Biden was vice president then, but for whatever reason, he chose to abandon Bagram. But if we had kept it, as I mentioned, it's not only built for that kind of evacuation, but it's also virtually impenetrable. It was built by the Soviets when they first came in and occupied Afghanistan. And it's easily defendable, but also it provides a platform for all of the different assets that we would have been able to use to essentially hold the Taliban at bay and keep them from Kabul, because it's close to Kabul. And so the rest of the country may have continued to fall, which I think, given the speed of what happened, was eventually inevitable. But there at least would have been a radius around which we could have safely evacuated American citizens, and that would have kind of been our final fallback point, would have been Bagram. But the Biden administration loves to act like this was somehow inevitable, and it wasn't. And in Kabul, we outline all of the different ways that the loss of life, the abandoned Americans, the just brutal conditions that people in Afghanistan are now suffering, all land at the feet of Joe Biden. He was the commander in chief. It was his decision, and he himself made it. And there has to be accountability for that.
Yes, as you said in the beginning of the book, there was a way that this could have been done differently. It did not have to occur the way that it did. James, thank you so much for coming on to Timeless. You know how much I enjoyed your book and our discussion here. And again, thank you so much for your service to our country.
Thank you, Julia. It was a lot of fun being here.
Thank you all so much for being here too. Reminder, hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified every time I post a new video. Take care. I'll see you soon.